The long drive. It was 11:45 p.m. when Ryan pulled onto the long, empty stretch of highway, his headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. He had just left his friend's place in the city and was heading back to his small apartment in the countryside. The road was desolate, just like the rest of the town he had grown up in, isolated and quiet, especially at night. It wasn't a long drive, maybe an hour or so, but the road had a reputation. The locals called it the Widow's Road. But Ryan had never been one to buy into superstitions. The air was cool, and the only sound inside the car was the hum of the tires on the pavement and the occasional rattle of the car's air conditioning. He turned up the radio, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The night was unusually still. Even the crickets outside seemed to be holding their breath. It wasn't long before he began to notice something strange. In the rear-view mirror, there was a car following him. Its headlights were far too bright, and it was keeping a consistent distance behind him, almost as if it was purposefully tailing him. Ryan tried to brush it off. Just another driver on the same stretch of road, he thought. But the car didn't overtake him, and the gap never widened. It was as if the driver was waiting for something. He checked his speed. He was going 60, the legal limit. He turned the radio dial, hoping to distract himself, but his nerves were starting to get the best of him. The car behind him blinked its high beams, a silent warning. Ryan felt a shiver crawl up his spine. What the hell? He glanced in the side mirror, trying to get a better look at the car, but it was just a blur of headlights, nothing distinct. He couldn't make out the model, and there were no other lights from other vehicles. Just the two of them on that endless road. Suddenly, a loud bang made him jump. He swerved slightly, but managed to regain control of the wheel. The sound had come from his passenger side. Heart pounding, Ryan glanced over, expecting to see some kind of object lodged in the side of the car. But there was nothing. His window, however, was cracked open slightly. He didn't remember doing that. The road seemed to stretch on forever. The lights of the car behind him seemed brighter now, more oppressive, and the quiet was almost suffocating. I need to pull over, Ryan thought, his anxiety climbing. Let this asshole pass, and I'll get on with it. He turned on his blinker and moved to the shoulder of the road. The car behind him didn't budge. In fact, it sped up, pulling in right behind him, the headlights nearly blinding him. Ryan's hands trembled on the steering wheel. Something about this felt off. What the hell is wrong with this guy? Ryan decided to get back on the road and accelerate, but as he pressed down on the gas pedal, the car behind him did the same, staying right on his tail. His heart began to race in his chest. He glanced at the speedometer. He was going 80 miles per hour now, and still, the car was right there, shadowing his every move. Something's wrong, Ryan thought. Panic set in, his thoughts spiraling. He looked for any sign of life on the road, any sign of another vehicle or a building, but there was nothing, just the darkness. Then something caught his eye. A small figure standing by the side of the road, partially hidden in the trees. His foot slammed on the brake instinctively, and his car jerked to a halt. The car behind him didn't slow down. Ryan's hands gripped the wheel as his breath came in shallow gasps. The figure was standing still now, just out of view from the headlights. His mind screamed at him to keep moving, to get out of there, but he couldn't. Something felt wrong. A sharp knock came from the passenger side of the car. Ryan spun his head to the side, but there was no one there. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone dragging something across the roof of the car. Terror gripped him. His instincts screamed at him to get out, but his body was frozen. Then he heard it, a voice, faint but clear, from just outside his window. "Help me." The voice was soft, like a whisper on the wind, but it felt like it came from everywhere at once. Ryan's skin went cold. He turned to look at the passenger side mirror, but there was nothing. Then, the figure by the side of the road moved. It didn't walk. It glided, as if floating, coming closer with terrifying speed. The lights from the car behind him illuminated it, casting a sickly yellow glow on its face. It was a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair hung in long, matted strands around her face. Her eyes were wide, black pits that seemed to suck in the light, reflecting only emptiness. Her mouth was twisted into an eerie grin, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Help me," she repeated, this time louder, as she floated up to his window. Ryan slammed the gas pedal to the floor, the tires screeching against the road, and the car shot forward. But the woman kept pace, gliding effortlessly beside him, her eyes locked onto his. He couldn't take it anymore. His breath came in short, panic bursts. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, and that's when he saw it. The car that had been following him was no longer there. Instead, there was a faint red glow, flickering in the distance, growing larger by the second. "Oh God, it's still following me." His mind raced. He couldn't outrun it, couldn't escape. But then, something inside him snapped. He slammed on the brakes again, throwing the car into a sharp turn off the road. The tires skidded as he veered onto a dirt path, the headlights illuminating nothing but trees and darkness. The woman's voice echoed in his head. "Help me." The red glow behind him was getting closer, and he could hear something scraping against the pavement, something dragging, something large and heavy. Ryan didn't stop. His hands were numb as he clutched the wheel, not daring to look back. The headlights in his rearview mirror finally disappeared, but the night was still. The sound stopped. For a moment, Ryan thought he was safe. Then he saw it. The road had come to an end. The path, once wide and clear, narrowed to a steep drop-off at the edge of a ravine. Ryan's heart slammed against his chest as he hit the brakes, but the car didn't stop in time. There was a loud crash. The world tilted sideways, and everything went black. The next morning, the police found Ryan's car at the bottom of the ravine. It had rolled off the road, but there was no sign of him. No sign of any other car or anyone who might have been involved. They found only one thing: scratches along the roof of the car, deep gouges, as though something had been climbing. And the road, it was called the Widow's Road for a reason. They say it's cursed, haunted by the restless spirits of those who have died on it, the victims of a car accident long ago. But Ryan's story didn't end there. Sometimes, when the moon is full and the night is quiet, people driving down that stretch of road late at night swear they see a pair of headlights in their rearview mirror, following them relentlessly, never passing, always keeping just enough distance to be menacing. And sometimes, when they stop, they hear a whisper on the wind. "Help me." The forest's whisper. Forrest had always been an adventurous soul. Growing up, he'd heard tales of the Whispering Woods, a dense forest on the outskirts of town where few dared to tread. It was said to be cursed, a place where the wind carried voices and strange creatures roamed in the shadows. But Forrest, with his insatiable curiosity, couldn't resist. He decided to explore it alone. One crisp autumn morning, he packed a backpack with essentials, a flashlight, some snacks, a map, and a journal. He told his parents he was heading to the woods, but never mentioned that he planned to go deep inside, to places no one had ventured in years. As Forrest stepped into the woods, the world around him grew quieter, the chirping of birds and rustling of leaves slowly fading away. A thick fog clung to the forest floor, and the towering trees stretched above him like gnarled fingers. The air was heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He walked for hours, the map in his hand growing increasingly useless as paths twisted and turned in unnatural ways. The deeper he ventured, the more the forest seemed to change. He heard rustling behind him, but when he turned, no one was there. A cold chill ran down his spine. "It's just the wind," he told himself. "It's just the wind." But then he began to hear the voices. At first, they were faint, soft whispers, like a lullaby carried on the breeze. He stopped and strained to listen. The words were unintelligible, like a language he couldn't quite grasp. He quickened his pace, trying to shake the unsettling feeling creeping over him. But the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a haunting melody. Forrest. Forrest. Come closer. His heart began to race. The voice sounded like his own, but distorted, drawn out in a way that made his skin crawl. He turned, but there was nothing but trees. No one. The whispers seemed to follow him, closing in, echoing through the dense fog. Panic gripped him, but he forced himself to keep moving. Suddenly, He heard a loud snap, the sound of a twig breaking underfoot. Forrest whipped around, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog. In the distance, he saw a figure standing among the trees, a tall, shadowy form, too still, too unnatural. It was watching him, his breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, but its eyes, two pinpricks of red light, were locked onto him. He froze, the weight of its gaze pressing on him like an invisible force. Then, as if beckoned by an unseen hand, the figure stepped forward, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Forrest's legs refused to move, his body frozen with fear. The whispers grew louder, now full of mocking laughter. "Come closer, Forrest." He stumbled backward, heart hammering in his chest. His flashlight flickered and died. Darkness engulfed him. The whispers turned into guttural growls, and the figure loomed closer, its twisted form shifting with each step it took. "You shouldn't have come." Forrest's breath came in ragged gasps. He turned and ran, the forest around him shifting in ways he couldn't comprehend. The trees closed in on him, branches reaching out like claws. The fog thickened, obscuring his vision. He didn't know how long he ran, but eventually, the sound of the whispers faded. The forest grew eerily quiet again. Forrest collapsed, exhausted, into a small clearing. He thought he had escaped, but when he looked up, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The trees surrounding the clearing were not trees at all. They were faces, twisted, tortured faces, all staring down at him with hollow eyes. "Forrest." The voice was everywhere, echoing from the trees, from the earth, from the very air itself. Forrest screamed, but no sound came out. His legs wouldn't move. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse, as if the forest itself was alive, breathing, waiting. The whispers grew louder, closer, and Forrest realized too late. The forest wasn't just cursed. The forest wanted him, and no one ever left the Whispering Woods. The end. The last countdown. It was the night before New Year's Eve in a sleepy town nestled between snow-capped mountains. The streets were coated in a blanket of white, and the smell of pine from nearby forests hung in the air. The town's residents were preparing for the annual New Year's Eve celebration. People bustled with last-minute shopping, decorating their homes, and making plans to gather at the town hall. Everyone was eager to ring in the new year with cheer and good fortune, but no one knew that this year would be different. Samantha had recently moved to the town, seeking refuge after a messy breakup and a life that felt like it had come to a halt. She rented a small cottage on the edge of town, far enough away from the noise to find peace, yet close enough to attend social events when she needed to. The idea of celebrating New Year's alone didn't appeal to her, but she wasn't in the mood for grand festivities either. That evening, as she sat by her window, staring at the town's lights twinkling in the distance, she heard a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found a man standing in the snow, his face partially hidden by the collar of his coat. He had an unusual presence about him, as though he didn't quite belong. "Hello," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an undertone that unsettled her. "I'm Robert. I'm sure you've heard of the tradition here in town." Samantha frowned, confused. "Tradition?" "Yes," Robert continued, a small smile playing at his lips. "Every year, at midnight, we all gather to watch the countdown. But there's something special this year, a new ritual. I thought you might be interested in participating." Samantha, despite her unease, nodded. A small part of her felt the pull of curiosity. She wasn't sure why, but she felt an odd connection to the man. "The countdown?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. "I've only just moved here. I didn't know about anything like that." Robert's smile widened. "It's not something people speak about openly, but you'll understand once you join us." With a quick glance at the clock, Samantha realized it was already close to 10 p.m. There wasn't much time left before the festivities began. She hesitated, but Robert seemed so sure of himself, so confident. Something about him made her feel both intrigued and wary, but she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight, something would happen, something important. They walked together through the snow-covered streets, with Robert leading the way. As they approached the town hall, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt thicker, colder, and the usual cheer of New Year's Eve seemed eerily absent. There were no fireworks, no laughter, no music. Only a few town folk stood huddled in silence near the large clock tower in the square. The clock tower's hands were frozen at 11:58 p.m. "Where is everyone?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling slightly. "They're here," Robert replied cryptically. "They just can't move yet." At that moment, a few figures turned to look at her. Their eyes seemed glazed, as though they weren't truly aware of her presence. They stood motionless, their faces pale and expressionless, as if caught in some kind of trance. Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. "What's going on? Why aren't they moving?" Robert didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured toward a large circle etched into the ground in front of the clock tower. It was surrounded by strange symbols, arcane markings she didn't recognize. The clock tower behind them began to chime, a slow, deliberate countdown that echoed across the square. "Get into the circle," Robert instructed, his voice now firm, his earlier warmth gone. Samantha hesitated, but something in his voice compelled her to comply. She stepped into the center of the circle. The cold was unbearable now, creeping into her bones as though the very air had turned hostile. The clock tower rang louder. 10, 9, 8. The sound of the bells was deafening, filling her head with a sharp, pulsating rhythm. The others in the square began to stir, their eyes still glazed, their bodies moving slowly, like puppets on invisible strings. 7, 6, 5. The atmosphere grew darker, and the snow began to fall faster, swirling in unnatural patterns, as if the night itself were trying to close in on them. Suddenly, Robert stepped into the circle with her, his smile now gone. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes gleamed with an intensity that made Samantha's heart race. "You should have never come here," he whispered, his voice no longer warm but cold, full of malice. "You're part of the ritual now." "What ritual?" Samantha stammered, backing away from him, but the circle beneath her feet seemed to trap her. 3, 2, 1. The bells rang one final time, and as the clock struck midnight, the ground beneath Samantha's feet cracked open. From the depths of the earth, a low, guttural roar erupted, sending tremors through the square. Figures cloaked in shadow began to emerge from the fissures in the ground, their eyes burning with an unholy fire. They were not human, and their presence was suffocating. Samantha screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the dark entities that rose from the earth. She could feel the pull of the circle, an invisible force keeping her rooted in place as the figures gathered around her. Robert's face twisted into a grin, his eyes now entirely black. "This is the price of the countdown," Robert said, his voice a distant echo in her mind. "Every year, one soul must join them, and tonight it's yours." Samantha tried to scream again, but the cold suffocated her, her voice dying in her throat. The shadows reached for her, their hands cold as death itself. She felt herself being pulled into the void, the world around her dissolving into darkness. As the clock struck midnight, the last sound Samantha heard was the hollow laughter of the townspeople, frozen, trapped in a never-ending loop of waiting for a new year that would never come. The countdown had ended, and she was the final sacrifice. In the town square, the clock tower remained stuck at 12 a.m. The snow continued to fall, and the town's residents stood motionless, their eyes empty, waiting for the next countdown to begin. And every year, on the eve of New Year's, the ritual would start again.